My name is David Miller, and I have always believed in the power of patterns. In my line of work, as a lead analyst for one of the most prominent tech firms in Chicago, I spend my days looking at data points that most people ignore. I look at the way a market fluctuates before a crash and the way a consumer's habit changes just before they lose interest in the subtle anomalies that signal a system is about to fail. My life was built on the foundation of those very same patterns. I had a predictable schedule, a predictable commute, and a predictable marriage. Or so I thought. The morning the pattern broke started like any other Tuesday in mid-October. The Chicago fog was thick enough to swallow the skyscrapers whole, and the view from our 32nd floor apartment on Lakeshore Drive was nothing but a wall of gray. I was in the kitchen waiting for the espresso machine to hiss into life. The apartment was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the city waking up below us. Sarah was still in bed, or at least I thought she was until I saw her tablet sitting on the marble island. It was face up, glowing with the pale blue light of a new notification. Usually I wouldn't even glance at it. We had a relationship built on trust, or what I perceived to be trust, for over a decade. But there was something about the timing. The screen flickered, and a name appeared that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. RH, Robert Harrison, my boss. The man who held the keys to my career and the man I had considered a mentor for the better part of 5 years. The message was short, but it carried the weight of a sledgehammer. It read simply, "It is all set for the conference. You'll be out of the way. Then we can finally be free." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just watched the screen until it dimmed and went black, leaving me staring at my own distorted reflection in the glass. My mind, which usually operated like a high-speed processor, suddenly felt like it was drowning in static. I began to run the numbers. I began to look for the anomalies I had missed over the last 6 months. The late nights Sarah spent at her design studio. The sudden increase in Robert's private meetings with me, where he praised my work while simultaneously asking for my personal login credentials to the secure server for maintenance reasons. It was all there. A perfect sequence of data points that I had been too blind to see because I was part of the set. I picked up the tablet. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I had spent years training myself to remain calm under pressure, and now that training was the only thing keeping me from shattering. I knew her passcode. It was our anniversary. The irony felt like a physical weight in my chest as I swiped the screen open. I didn't look for photos or sentimental messages. I went straight to the source, the archived emails and the encrypted messaging apps. What I found was far worse than a simple betrayal of the heart. It was a professional execution. There were drafts of documents and edited spreadsheets. Robert had been funneling company funds into a series of offshore accounts, and he had been using my digital signature to authorize every single transaction. Sarah had been the one helping him coordinate the logistics. She was a designer by trade, but she had a brilliant mind for organization. She had been the one to suggest using the upcoming national conference in Chicago as the final stage for the handoff. They weren't just planning to leave me. They were planning to leave me in the middle of a legal catastrophe that would ensure I spent the rest of my life behind bars while they disappeared with a fortune. The espresso machine finally hissed, and the sound made me jump. I quickly put the tablet back exactly where I had found it and turned around to grab a mug. My heart was racing now, but my face remained a mask of professional indifference. "Good morning, honey." Sarah's voice came from the hallway. She was wearing her silk robe, the one I had bought her for her birthday. She looked beautiful and radiant and completely and utterly unrecognizable to me. She walked into the kitchen and leaned against the counter watching the fog outside. "Morning," I said. My voice sounded thin to my own ears, but she didn't seem to notice. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, reaching for the tablet. My pulse spiked as her fingers brushed the glass. "Fine," I replied, just thinking about the conference. Robert wants the final analytics on his desk by noon. Sarah smiled. It was the same smile she had given me at our wedding. It was warm and encouraging, and it was a lie. "You've worked so hard for this, David. Robert really relies on you. This conference is going to change everything for us." I looked at her, and for a moment, I felt a wave of such intense grief that I thought I might actually break character. She was right. This conference was going to change everything. but not in the way she expected. I took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like ash. I watched her check her messages, her thumb sliding over the screen where Robert's name had been just minutes ago. She didn't flinch. She didn't look guilty. She just sipped her tea and talked about the weather and the guest list for the gala. I realized then that I wasn't married to the woman I thought I was. I was living with a stranger who had been meticulously dismantling my life while I slept beside her. And Robert Harrison, the man who had given me a corner office and a six-figure bonus, was the architect of my ruin. I left for the office an hour later. The commute was a blur of gray concrete and yellow taxi lights. As I walked through the glass doors of the Harrison IT headquarters, I felt like I was walking into a lion's den. But I wasn't the prey anymore. I was an observer. The office was buzzing with the energy of the upcoming summit. There were banners being hung and assistants running back and forth with badges and itineraries. I walked past the mahogany doors of Robert's suite and saw him through the glass. He was on the phone laughing and gesturing with a silver pen. He saw me and waved a hand, beckoning me inside. David, just the man I wanted to see, he boomed as I entered. He stood up and walked around his desk, giving me a firm grip on the shoulder. Are we ready to take over the world? We're ready, Robert, the first said. I looked him straight in the eyes, and I didn't see a mentor. I saw a man who was arrogant enough to believe he could steal a man's life and expect him to thank him for it. The data is looking solid, I continued. I've finalized the presentation for the main stage. Everything is perfectly aligned. Excellent, Robert said. He leaned back against his desk, crossing his arms. You know, David, I've always valued your precision. You have a way of seeing things that others miss. That's why I trust you with the big stuff. I nodded slowly. I appreciate that trust, Robert. More than you know. He checked his watch. Listen, I've got a lunch with the board, but let's catch up tonight. Sarah told me you guys might stop by the hotel pre-party. We wouldn't miss it, I replied. As I walked out of his office, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. They thought they were playing a game of chess against a man who didn't know the rules. They thought they had already won because they had the board and the pieces. But they forgot one thing about analysts. We don't just look at the board. We look at the room. We look at the power supply. We look at the hidden variables that no one else accounts for. I went to my desk and opened my laptop. I didn't start on the presentation. Instead, I began to write a script. Not a coding script, but a narrative. Every action they had taken, every message they had sent, every cent they had moved was a data point that I was now going to redirect. They wanted to use the conference to destroy me. Fine. I would give them the conference of a lifetime. I would give them a stage and a spotlight and a global audience. And then I would let the world watch as their perfect lives disintegrated into the very dust they tried to bury me in. I spent the next 8 hours buried in the server architecture. I found the backdoors Robert had created, and I didn't close them. I expanded them. I made sure that every piece of evidence of his fraud was not just stored, but duplicated and linked to his personal devices in a way that could never be erased. I looked into his health records, too. I knew about his delicate stomach and his obsession with a specific green juice cleanse he did before every major speech to keep his energy up. It was a small detail, a minor variable, but in a complex system, a small change can lead to a total collapse. I thought about the dose. It had to be enough to be undeniable, but not enough to be considered a physical threat. I needed it to be a public spectacle. I needed him to lose his dignity in front of the people he craved respect from most. As the sun began to set over the Chicago skyline, I looked at the photo of Sarah on my desk. I remembered the day it was taken. We were in Napa Valley, and she was laughing as I tried to capture the light hitting the vineyards. I wondered when the woman in that photo had disappeared. I wondered if she had ever existed at all, or if she was just another projection I had analyzed incorrectly. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt nothing but the cold necessity of a correction. When a system is corrupted, you don't try to fix it. You purge it. You reset it. You start over. I packed my bag and headed down to the lobby. The city was alive with the glow of 1,000 windows, and for the first time in 10 years, I felt like I was finally seeing it for what it really was. A place of endless transactions and hidden costs. I was going home to the woman who was helping my boss ruin me. I would sit across from her at dinner. I would listen to her talk about her day. I would kiss her cheek before we went to sleep. And all the while I would be counting down the minutes until the summit began. The pattern was changing. And for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the pen. The walk from the train station to our building was brisk. The wind coming off the lake was biting, and it carried the scent of rain. I watched the people passing by, each of them absorbed in their own small dramas, and I felt a strange sense of detachment. I was no longer a participant in a normal world. I was an observer waiting for the moment to strike. When I entered the apartment, Sarah was in the kitchen pouring 2 glasses of red wine. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, and the lights were dimmed to a soft, warm glow. It was a scene of domestic bliss that would have fooled anyone. "Hey," she said, walking over to give me a kiss. "You look exhausted. Rough day." "Just a lot of moving parts," one said, taking the glass from her. "Robert is feeling the pressure." "He always does," she said with a light laugh. "But he has you to keep him grounded. You're his secret weapon, David." I took a long sip of the wine. It was a heavy Cabernet, dark and complex. I'm starting to realize that's Sarah. I really am. We sat down to dinner, and she talked about a new client she had landed. She talked about the fabrics she was choosing and the way the light hit the office space. She was so convincing. Her voice was steady, her eyes were bright, and her interest in my life seemed genuine. I watched her closely, looking for the micro expressions of guilt or hesitation. There were none. She was a professional. "Are you nervous about the keynote?" she asked, cutting a piece of chicken. "Not really," I said. "I've run the simulations. I know exactly how it's going to go." "That's my David," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Always prepared." I felt the warmth of her hand, and I thought about the message on the tablet. "He'll be out of the way. Then we can finally be free." I wonder where they plan to go. A villa in the south of France? A penthouse in New York? How much of my life had been sold to pay for their freedom? I didn't ask. I just smiled back and told her I loved her. Later that night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The blue light of the city filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. I thought about the next 48 hours. I thought about the conference hall and the cameras and the thousands of people who would be watching. I wasn't just going to take their money or their careers. I was going to take their reality. I was going to show them that the man they thought they could discard was the one who had been keeping their world together all along. And once I pulled the plug, there would be nothing left but the cold, hard truth. I got out of bed and went to my home office. I sat down at my desk and pulled up the final version of the keynote presentation. I scrolled through the slides of growth charts and innovation metrics. Then I opened a hidden file on my encrypted drive. It was a series of video clips and audio recordings and bank statements. I dragged them into the presentation folder and set the trigger. The trigger was simple. It was linked to the heart rate monitor on Robert's smartwatch, which I had synced to the server during a routine troubleshooting session a week ago. When his heart rate hit a certain threshold of stress, the presentation would automatically switch from the corporate fluff to the reality of his crimes. It was a masterpiece of analytical vengeance. I shut down the computer and went back to the bedroom. I looked at Sarah one last time before I closed my eyes. She looked so peaceful in the shadows. I wondered if she would still look that way when she realized that the freedom she wanted was actually the beginning of her end. The patterns were set. The data was locked. And tomorrow the world would see what happens when the most observant man in the room finally decides to act. I woke up at 5 in the morning, long before the sun had a chance to pierce the Chicago overcast. The silence of the apartment felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. I moved through my routine with a mechanical precision. Shower, shave, suit. I chose a dark navy blue, one sharp and professional. I wanted to look like the man everyone expected me to be. Sarah was still asleep when I left. I didn't wake her. I didn't leave a note. I just walked out of the door and into the cool morning air. The Grand Regency was already teeming with activity when I arrived. The lobby was a sea of suits and lanyards, and the smell of expensive cologne and industrial floor wax. I made my way to the backstage area where the technical crew was setting up the monitors. "Hey, David, you're early," one of the techs said. "Just want to make sure the interface is responsive," I said. "You know how Robert gets if there's a lag." "Tell me about it," the tech laughed. "He's already been in here twice asking about the lighting." I moved to the main console and plugged in my drive. I performed a series of routine checks, making sure the wireless connection was stable. While the tech was distracted with a cable, I uploaded the final payload. It sat there invisible and silent, waiting for the moment of peak tension. Robert arrived at 8 o'clock, looking like a man who owned the world. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit and a smile that had been practiced in 1,000 mirrors. He was flanked by his assistants and a group of high-level investors. "David," looking sharp, he said, clapping me on the back. "Ready for the big show?" "Everything is set, Robert," the first said. "The presentation is loaded and the live stream is live." Good, he said. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning for any sign of imperfection. "Where's the juice?" "I need my green fuel." One of his assistants hurried over with a glass of bright green liquid. Robert took it and downed half of it in one go. "That's the stuff," he said, wiping his mouth. "All right, everyone, let's get into position. 10 minutes to go." I watched him walk away, and I felt a surge of cold adrenaline. The juice had been easy to access. The assistant was overworked and distracted, and it had only taken a few seconds to slip the additive into the bottle before it was poured. It was a high-potency medical-grade substance designed for clinical use. It was colorless and odorless, and in 20 minutes, it would begin to interact with Robert's nervous system in a way that would make it impossible for him to maintain his composure. I took my seat in the front row next to the empty chair reserved for Sarah. She would be arriving shortly. I looked at my watch. The countdown had begun. The lights dimmed, and the music swelled. A voice boomed over the speakers announcing the arrival of the visionary CEO of Harrison IT. Robert walked onto the stage to a thunderous round of applause. He looked confident and powerful and completely unaware that his life was about to become a national headline. He started his speech with a joke about the weather. The audience laughed. He moved into the first segment of the presentation, talking about the future of connectivity and the importance of integrity in the digital age. I looked at the side door and saw Sarah enter. She was wearing a stunning red dress, and she moved with a grace that made people turn their heads. She saw me and made her way down the aisle, slipping into the seat next to me. She leaned in and whispered I made it. "How does he look?" "He looks like he's having the time of his life," I said. She smiled and turned her attention to the stage. I watched her profile. I watched the way she cheered for the man who was planning to take her away from me. I felt a strange sense of pity for her. She had no idea that the man on stage was already a ghost. 10 minutes in, and Robert's face began to change. The confident smile faltered, and a slight sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He began to speak faster, skipping over words and losing his place in the script. The additive was starting to work. He tried to take a sip of water, but his hand was shaking. He looked out at the audience, his eyes wide and unfocused. He was fighting a battle that he couldn't win. The physical symptoms were becoming undeniable. I checked my phone. His heart rate was climbing. 100 beats per minute. 110. 120. The system detected the spike. Suddenly the screen behind Robert flickered. The slide about cloud storage disappeared and was replaced by a high-definition image of a bank statement from the Cayman Islands. The audience went silent. Robert turned around, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "What is this?" He stammered into the microphone. "There's a technical error. Someone fix this." I didn't move. Sarah gripped my arm, her face pale. "David, what's happening?" I didn't answer. I just watched the screen. The bank statement was followed by a recording of a phone call. Robert's voice filled the hall loud and clear. "Just make sure the signature looks like David's." He's too busy looking at numbers to notice a few million moving around. "Once the conference is over, we're out of here." The sound of the audience's collective gasp was like a physical wave. Robert was frozen on stage, his eyes darting back and forth like a trapped animal. He tried to speak, but the physical effects of the additive finally reached their peak. He didn't just lose his career that day. He lost his dignity in a way that was so visceral and so public that it would be talked about for decades. He collapsed onto his knees, his face contorted in a mix of agony and shame. The cameras captured every second of it, broadcasting his downfall to millions of people around the world. Sarah was shaking now. She looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. She saw her own name appear in a series of emails discussing the logistics of the move. She saw the evidence of her own betrayal laid bare for everyone to see. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. "David, please." I turned to look at her. I didn't see the woman I loved. I didn't even see an enemy. I just saw a data point that had been corrected. The pattern is complete, Sarah, I said quietly. I stood up and straightened my jacket. The hall was in total chaos now. Security was rushing onto the stage, and the investors were shouting, and the press was scrambling for the best angle. It was a perfect storm of social and professional destruction. I walked toward the exit, moving against the flow of the panicked crowd. I didn't look back at the stage. I didn't look back at the woman in the red dress. I just walked out of the building and into the bright, cold light of the afternoon. The fog had finally lifted. The skyscrapers were sharp and clear against the blue sky. I took a deep breath of the crisp air, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to analyze anything. The system had been reset. The corruption had been purged. And as I walked down the street, I realized that the future was no longer a series of predictable data points. It was an open road. I was David Miller, and I was finally free. The office on the 45th floor of the Harrison Tower felt different on Wednesday morning. To anyone else, it was the same glass and steel cathedral of ambition, but to me, it had become a crime scene where the evidence was still being written in real time. I walked through the open floor plan, watching my colleagues. They were busy preparing for the summit. They were checking spreadsheets and finalizing logistics for the transport of the servers. There were cogs in a machine that I had helped build, and now I was the one looking for the loose screw that would bring it all down. I sat at my desk and opened my terminal. The blue light reflected in my glasses, and for a moment, I just stared at the blinking cursor. It was a heart rate monitor for a dying company. I needed to move fast, but with the precision of a surgeon. The first task was the acquisition of the catalyst. I knew that Robert was obsessed with his health. He spent thousands of dollars a month on a specialized nutritionist who designed a specific biological regimen for him. Every morning during a high-pressure event, Robert drank a concoction of rare enzymes and concentrated nutrients. He called it his edge. I called it his vulnerability. I spent the first 2 hours of the morning researching the specific chemical composition of his green juice. It was a proprietary blend, but I had access to the company's expense reports. I knew the supplier. I knew the ingredients. And more importantly, I knew what could be added to that blend without changing the color or the taste, but with a delayed reaction that would coincide perfectly with the middle of his 45-minute keynote. I didn't want something crude. I wanted something that would act with mathematical certainty. I found what I was looking for on a specialized medical supply site. It was a high-potency metabolic accelerator used for rapid internal cleansing before specific types of diagnostic imaging. It was clear and tasteless. In a standard dose, it worked within hours. In a concentrated dose, combined with the specific acidity of Robert's green juice, the reaction time would be cut to exactly 40 minutes. I placed the order using a burner account and a drop-off location 3 blocks from the hotel. The next step was the digital infrastructure. Robert and Sarah were smart, but they were arrogant. They believed that because I was a quiet man, I was a simple man. They thought that my loyalty was a result of my lack of imagination. I spent the afternoon diving deep into the server logs. I wasn't just looking for the money they had moved. I was looking for the trail of breadcrumbs they had left to frame me. Robert had been clever. He had used a series of automated scripts to sign my name to the transfers. From the outside, it looked like I had been slowly draining the corporate accounts over the last 18 months. But he made one mistake. He used the company's internal network to test the scripts. He thought he had deleted the logs, but in a high-level system, nothing is ever truly gone. It's just moved to a different sector of the memory. I began to recover the deleted packets. It was like piecing together a shredded photograph. Every line of code I recovered was another nail in his professional coffin. I saw the timestamps. I saw the IP addresses. I saw the way he had mapped out my downfall while he was inviting me to his house for dinner. The betrayal was so methodical that it almost felt like a compliment. He thought I was dangerous enough to warrant this level of effort. As I worked, I felt a presence behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew the scent of her perfume. "Sarah, are you still coming to the rehearsal tonight?" she asked. Her hand rested on the back of my chair. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. It was a touch that used to bring me comfort, but now it felt like a brand. "I wouldn't miss it," I said, my voice steady. "Robert wanted me to check the audio-visual sync one last time." Sarah leaned down, her hair brushing against my shoulder. You've been so distant lately, David. I know the summit is stressful, but I miss my husband. I looked at the screen, which was currently displaying a complex data set that looked like gibberish to the untrained eye. I'm just focused, Sarah. This is the biggest moment of our lives. Everything is riding on this. She kissed the top of my head. I know, and I'm so proud of you. I'll see you at the hotel at 7. I nodded. I watched her reflection in the glass as she walked away. She stopped to talk to an assistant, laughing at something the girl said. She looked so innocent, so supportive. It was a masterpiece of performance art. I turned back to the screen and hit the enter key. The final batch of recovered data began to download. I had the proof. Now I needed the delivery system. The hotel ballroom was a massive space capable of seating 3,000 people. It was equipped with a state-of-the-art projection system and a surround sound setup that could make a whisper sound like a shout. The entire event was controlled by a central server located in a secure room behind the stage. I had the credentials to access that room. I spent the evening at the rehearsal playing the part of the diligent technician. I walked the stage with Robert. I checked the microphones. I adjusted the lighting. Make sure that logo is crisp, David, Robert said, gesturing to the massive screen. I want them to see the future in high definition. I looked at the logo, the stylized H for Harrison IT. It was a symbol of power and innovation. To me, it looked like a target. It will be the clearest thing they've ever seen, Robert the first promised. As the crew began to pack up for the night, I slipped into the server room. It was cold and loud, filled with the hum of cooling fans. I sat down at the terminal and opened the directory for the morning's presentation. Robert's slides were all there, but I wasn't interested in the slides. I was interested in the metadata. I began to inject a series of hidden triggers into the file. These triggers were set to activate based on the duration of the file being open. At the 20-minute mark, a background process would begin to upload the recovered data to the public cloud and generate a QR code that would appear on the screen. At the 25-minute mark, the audio system would switch from Robert's microphone to a pre-recorded loop of the incriminating phone calls I had intercepted. And at the 30-minute mark, the screen would display the bank statements and the email chains that linked Robert and Sarah to the fraud. It was a digital time bomb. I tested the script in a virtual environment. It worked perfectly. The beauty of it was that it appeared to be a system failure caused by a breach from an external source. It would look like a hack, and in the chaos, no one would be looking at the quiet analyst in the front row. I left the hotel at midnight. The city was quiet, and the air was sharp with the promise of storm. I walked home, my mind racing. I was no longer just a man who had been betrayed. I was a man who was redefining the narrative. I thought about the concept of freedom. Sarah and Robert wanted freedom from their responsibilities and freedom from me. They wanted to start a new life with money that didn't belong to them. They thought they could buy their way out of the consequences of their actions. But freedom isn't something you can buy. It's something you earn by facing the truth. I arrived at the apartment and found Sarah waiting for me. She had a bottle of wine open and 2 glasses on the table. To the future, she said, raising her glass. To the future, I replied. We drank in silence. I looked at the walls of our home, at the photos of our vacations, and the furniture we had chosen together. It was a museum of a dead relationship. Every object was a reminder of a lie. I wondered if she ever felt the weight of it. I wondered if she ever looked at me and felt a flicker of regret. But as she talked about her plans for the next month, I realized that she had already moved on. I was just a ghost she hadn't finished exorcising. The next morning was the start of the summit. I was at the hotel by 6. I went straight to the catering kitchen. I knew the staff. I had worked with them for years on various corporate events. I found a tray for Robert's green juice. It was sitting in the walk-in cooler labeled with his name. I waited for the prep cook to leave the room. It only took 5 seconds. I pulled the small vial from my pocket and emptied it into the bottle. I shook it gently to make sure it was fully integrated. The liquid remained the same vibrant shade of green. It was done. I spent the rest of the morning in a state of hyper-awareness. I saw everything. The way the light hit the stage. The way the investors whispered in the halls. The way Robert paced in the green room, his energy high, his confidence unshakable. He was ready for his triumph. Sarah arrived around 9. She was wearing a dress that cost more than my first car. She looked like a queen. She took her seat next to me, her hand resting on my knee. "Are you okay?" She whispered. "You're shaking." "I'm just excited," I said. "It's finally happening." The lights in the ballroom dimmed. The music started, a driving, rhythmic pulse that built anticipation. The announcer took the stage, and the crowd fell silent. When Robert's name was called, the room erupted in applause. He walked out with his arms raised, a man at the peak of his power. He began to speak, and I could see the moment the juice started to hit his system. It started as a small twitch in his jaw. Then he began to shift his weight. He took a sip of water, but it didn't seem to help. He was trying to push through his professional training, fighting against his body's sudden and violent rebellion. I looked at my watch. We were at the 15-minute mark. The presentation moved to the second phase. Robert was sweating now. The confident tone of his voice was being replaced by a strained rasp. He was skipping entire sections of his speech. The audience noticed. The whispering began. I felt Sarah's grip on my knee tighten. "Something is wrong," she said. "He's just nervous," I replied. "It's a big crowd." But I knew the chemistry was working. I knew the internal pressure was reaching a breaking point. Robert looked at the wings of the stage, hoping for a signal to stop, but the show had to go on. There were cameras everywhere. This was being streamed to every major financial news outlet in the country. He couldn't just walk away. At the 20-minute mark, the screen behind him flickered. The QR code appeared. People in the audience began to pull out their phones. I saw the confusion on their faces turn to shock as they scanned the code and saw the documents I had uploaded. The first domino had fallen. At the 25-minute mark, the audio switched. Robert was in the middle of a sentence about corporate responsibility when his own voice boomed over the speakers. "David won't know what hit him. By the time he figures out the accounts are empty, we'll be on the plane." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert froze. He looked at the speakers, then at the audience, then at me. His face was a mask of pure terror. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. And then the final stage of the catalyst took hold. It was a collapse of both his professional and physical integrity. He didn't just lose the audience. He lost himself. He was forced to flee the stage, his exit captured by a dozen cameras and broadcast to the world. Sarah stood up, her face white. "We have to go," she said, grabbing my arm. "We have to go now." I didn't move. I stayed in my seat, watching the screen. The bank statements were scrolling now. The emails were being read by an automated voice. The entire room was in an uproar. "David!" Sarah shouted. I looked up at her. I saw the panic in her eyes. I saw the realization that her perfect plan had turned into a nightmare. "You go ahead, Sarah," I said. "I think I'll stay for the ending." I watched her run for the exit, her heels clicking on the marble floor. I was alone in the front row, surrounded by the wreckage of Robert's empire. I felt a strange sense of peace. The pattern was resolved. The anomaly had been corrected. I stayed for another 10 minutes watching the screens until the security team finally figured out how to shut down the server. The hall was empty of everyone except for a few shocked reporters and the cleaning crew. I stood up and walked toward the stage. I looked at the podium where Robert had stood. I saw the spilled glass of water and the crumpled notes of his speech. It was the debris of a ruined life. I walked backstage and found the green room. Robert was gone. His assistants were in tears. The room smelled of fear and failure. I walked out of the hotel and into the cool, gray afternoon. The rain had started to fall, a gentle mist that washed away the dust of the city. I walked for hours. I didn't have a destination. I just wanted to feel the movement of the world. I thought about what would happen next. There would be investigations. There would be lawsuits. There would be a long and painful process of untangling the lies. But for me, the work was done. I had used my skills to reveal the truth. I had used the tools of my trade to hold the powerful accountable. I had been the silent analyst, and I had delivered the final report. As the sun began to set, I found myself on the pier looking out at the lake. The water was dark and deep. I thought about the woman I had married and the man I had worked for. I wondered if they would ever understand what had happened. I wondered if they would ever realize that they hadn't been defeated by a hack or a glitch. They had been defeated by the very man they thought they could ignore. I pulled my phone from my pocket and deleted the messaging app. I deleted the files. I deleted the history. I was a clean slate. I was a man without a pattern. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need to know what came next. I just needed to be. The wind picked up, blowing the rain against my face. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of the city. It was a symphony of a million different data points, all moving in their own directions. And I was just one of them. Small, quiet, and finally free. I thought back to the first day I had started at Harrison IT. Robert had given me a tour of the building. He had shown me the servers and the offices and the view from the top. He had told me that the sky was the limit. He had told me that if I worked hard, I could have everything he had. I realized now that he was right. I had seen everything he had. I had seen the greed and the vanity and the emptiness of it all. And I had decided that I didn't want any of it. I wanted something else. I wanted a life that was built on something more than just numbers on a screen. I wanted a life that was real. I walked back toward the city, the lights of the skyscrapers reflecting in the puddles on the ground. The world was still there. The machine was still turning. But I was no longer a part of it. I was a spectator, and the view from here was much better. I went to a small cafe and ordered a cup of black coffee. I sat by the window watching the people go by. I felt a sense of lightness that I hadn't felt in years. The burden of the lie was gone. The weight of the betrayal had been lifted. I was just David Miller, a man with a cup of coffee and a future that was entirely his own. I thought about Sarah. I wondered where she was. I wondered if she was hiding a hotel room or if she was already looking for a way to save herself. I knew she would try. She was a survivor. But I also knew that she would never be able to escape the truth of what she had done. It would be there in every mirror she looked into. It would be there in every conversation she had. She was a designer of spaces, but she had designed a prison for herself. As for Robert, he was finished. No company would touch him. No investor would trust him. He had become a joke, a cautionary tale, told in boardrooms and barrooms alike. He had wanted the world to know his name, and now they did. But not in the way he had planned. I finished my coffee and walked out into the night. The rain had stopped, and the stars were starting to peek through the clouds. I looked up at them and smiled. The universe was vast and complex and beautiful, and for the first time I wasn't trying to analyze it. I was just enjoying the show. The next few weeks would be difficult, I knew. There would be lawyers and questions, and the media would be relentless. But I was ready for it. I had the facts on my side. I had the truth. And in the end, that was the only data point that mattered. I walked home to my quiet apartment. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the dark looking out at the city. I felt a sense of closure. The chapter was over. The story was finished. And as I closed my eyes, I knew that the morning would bring a new beginning, a new pattern, a new life. And this time I would be the one to design it. I thought about the nature of power. Robert had power because of his position and his wealth. He thought that made him untouchable. But true power isn't about what you have. It's about what you know. It's about the ability to see the world as it really is, not as you want it to be. I had been the one with the power all along. I had been the one who understood the system. And when the time came, I was the one who knew how to change it. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. It was about making sure that the truth was heard. And it had been heard, loud and clear. I lay down on the bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke up the next morning feeling refreshed. I made myself breakfast and read the news. The headlines were exactly what I expected. The fall of Harrison IT, the scandal of the century, the public disgrace of a tech titan. I read the articles with a detached interest. It was like reading about a different world. I spent the day packing my things. I didn't want to stay in the apartment anymore. It held too many memories of a life that wasn't mine. I found a small house in a quiet neighborhood outside the city. It had a garden and a view of the woods. It was perfect. I moved in a week later. The transition was easy. I didn't bring much with me, just the essentials. I wanted to start over with a clean slate. I spent my days working in the garden and my evenings reading by the fire. It was a simple life, but it was a good one. I didn't miss the city. I didn't miss the office. I didn't miss the noise. I had found a new kind of peace, a peace that came from within. I occasionally checked the news to see how the investigation was going. Robert had been charged with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. Sarah was being investigated as a co-conspirator. It was a slow process, but the outcome was inevitable. They were going to pay for what they had done. I didn't feel any joy in their suffering. I just felt a sense of justice. It was the natural consequence of their choices. I had moved on, and I hoped that one day they would too. But for now, I was happy. I was free, and I was living my life on my own terms. I thought about the people I had worked with. I hoped that they were doing well. I hoped that they had found new jobs and that they were moving on from the scandal. I knew that it had been hard on them, but I also knew that they were resilient. They would find their way. As for me, I was content. I had my garden and my books and my peace. I didn't need anything else. I had found what I was looking for. I had found myself. The end of the story wasn't a tragedy or a triumph. It was just a resolution, a return to a state of balance. And that was enough. I sat on my porch watching the sunset. The sky was a beautiful shade of orange and purple. I breathed in the cool evening air and felt a sense of profound gratitude. I had been through the fire, and I had come out the other side. I was stronger, I was wiser, and I was more alive than I had ever been. I looked out at the woods and felt a sense of connection to the world. I was no longer just an observer. I was a participant, and I was ready for whatever came next. The shadows grew longer as the sun disappeared behind the trees. I stood up and went inside, closing the door behind me. The house was warm and quiet. I lit a candle and sat down at my desk. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and a pen. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a script. I just had a thought, and I began to write, not as an analyst, but as a man who had found his voice, a man who had found his way, a man who was finally home. And as the ink flowed onto the page, I knew that this was the start of something beautiful. A new story, a new life, and it was all mine. The silence of the house was a comfort, a sanctuary. I thought about the millions of people in the city, each with their own patterns and their own secrets. I wondered how many of them were living a lie. I wondered how many of them were waiting for someone to notice. I hoped that one day they would find the courage to speak their truth. I hoped that they would find their own path to freedom. But for now, I was just happy to have found mine. I finished writing and looked at the page. It wasn't a report or a spreadsheet. It was a poem, a simple expression of how I felt in that moment. It was raw and honest and real, and it was the most important thing I had ever written. I smiled and put the pen down. I was ready for bed. I blew out the candle and walked to the window. The moon was high in the sky, casting a silver light over the world. It was a beautiful night, and as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that everything was going to be okay. The pattern was complete, and I was free. I thought about the word free. It had so many different meanings. To Robert, it meant being able to do whatever he wanted without consequences. To Sarah, it meant having enough money to never have to worry again. To me, it meant being able to look in the mirror and like the person I saw. It meant being able to sleep at night knowing that I had done the right thing. It meant being able to live a life that was honest and true. And that was the greatest freedom of all. I realized that the summit hadn't just been a downfall for Robert and Sarah. It had been a rising for me. It had been the moment I finally stepped out of the shadows and into the light. It had been the moment I finally took control of my own destiny. And I wouldn't change a thing. Every step, every choice, every moment of pain had led me to this place. And this place was exactly where I was meant to be. I was a man who had been broken and then rebuilt. I was a man who had seen the worst of people and then found the best in himself. I was a man who was finally at peace. And as I slept, I dreamed of the woods and the garden and the simple beauty of a life well lived. I dreamed of a future that was bright and open and full of possibility. And when I woke up, I knew that the dream was real. I was alive. I was free. And I was ready for the new day. The sun rose over the trees, casting a warm glow over the room. I got out of bed and stretched, feeling the strength in my body. I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee. I sat on the porch and watched the birds. The world was waking up, and I was a part of it. I felt a sense of belonging that I hadn't felt in a long time. I was home, and that was all that mattered. I looked at the garden and saw the first sprouts of the flowers I had planted. They were small and delicate, but they were growing. They were a symbol of new life and new beginnings. And I was going to take care of them. I was going to watch them grow and bloom, just like I was going to watch my own life grow and bloom. I took a sip of my coffee and felt the warmth spread through my chest. It was a good day, a beautiful day, and I was going to make the most of it. I had no more secrets, no more lies, no more patterns to analyze. I just had the present moment, and that was enough. I was David Miller, and I was finally truly happy. The dawn of the summit did not arrive with a sunrise, but with the cold, artificial glow of the monitors in the Grand Regency's command center. I had been awake since 4 in the morning, watching the logistics of the hotel breathe like a giant mechanical beast. To the hundreds of staff members scurrying through the corridors, I was just another executive with insomnia, but to myself, I was the architect of a systemic collapse. The Grand Regency was a masterpiece of mid-century opulence renovated with 21st-century glass and steel. Its ballroom was a cavernous space designed to make the speaker feel like a deity and the audience feel like a congregation. I stood at the back of the hall as the sun began to hit the skyscrapers of Chicago outside, feeling the vibration of the city's morning traffic through the floorboards. Today was the day the pattern would finally break. I made my way to the catering prep area around 6:30. The air back there was thick with the scent of expensive dark roast coffee and industrial-strength cleaning agents. I moved with a practiced anonymity. I wore my backstage pass visibly and carried a tablet as if I were auditing the inventory. The staff was too busy with the thousands of croissants and fruit platters to notice a quiet man in a tailored suit. I found the specialized refrigeration unit marked for the keynote speakers. Robert's green juice was there nestled in a bed of crushed ice. It was a vibrant, almost radioactive shade of emerald. I checked the label. It was the specific blend he demanded before every major speech. He believed it cleared his mind and sharpened his focus. I knew it was his greatest vanity. I waited for the executive chef to turn his back to consult with a server. It took only a few seconds. I pulled the vial from my pocket. It was a concentrated, colorless liquid, an intensive metabolic catalyst, used in clinical settings to clear a patient's system with absolute speed. In the quantities I had prepared, it would not cause permanent harm, but it would ensure a total loss of physical composure. I unscrewed the cap of his juice and poured the catalyst inside. I watched as the clear liquid vanished into the green. I replaced the cap, gave it a gentle swirl, and set it back on the ice. The transaction was complete. The biological variable had been introduced into the system. By 8 o'clock, the ballroom was filling up. The energy in the room was a palpable thing, a mixture of ambition, greed, and genuine curiosity. These were the titans of the industry, the people who moved markets with a tweet and decided the fate of startups over lunch. I took my seat in the front row. The chair to my left was empty, reserved for Sarah. I looked at the stage. The podium was a sleek, minimalist structure of brushed aluminum. Behind it, a screen the size of a tennis court displayed the Harrison IT logo in high definition. It looked clean. It looked professional. It was a lie. Sarah arrived 10 minutes before the start. She looked stunning in a deep charcoal suit, her hair pulled back in a sharp professional bun. She smelled of jasmine and expensive perfume. She slipped into the seat beside me and leaned in to whisper, "You look tense, David. Relax. This is going to be a great day for us." I turned to look at her. I wondered how she could say the word us with such conviction while she had been planning to leave me with nothing but a legal nightmare. I realized then that she didn't just lie, she inhabited the lie. She was a designer of environments, and she had designed a reality where she was the loyal wife and I was the unsuspecting husband. "I'm just focused, Sarah," I said. "I want to make sure everything goes exactly as planned." She patted my hand. "It will. Robert is in the best mood I've seen him in years. He's ready to change the world." The lights dimmed and a silence fell over the room that felt like a held breath. The music started, a low, rhythmic pulse that vibrated in the chest. A voice resonated through the hidden speakers announcing Robert Harrison. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Robert walked onto the stage with a stride that suggested he owned the ground he walked on. He waved to the crowd, his teeth flashing white in the spotlight. He looked like the personification of success. He took a sip from the green juice, sitting on the podium, and began his speech. His voice was a smooth baritone, confident and commanding. He talked about the evolution of data, about the responsibility of leaders to protect the integrity of the systems they build. He talked about transparency and trust. The irony was so thick it felt like it was choking the air out of the room. I watched him closely. I wasn't listening to his words, I was monitoring his physiology. 10 minutes and the first sign appeared. A bead of sweat broke on his forehead and rolled down into his eyebrow. He wiped it away with a quick flick of his finger. His pacing on the stage slowed. He began to grip the edges of the podium. I looked at my watch. The catalyst was beginning its work. Another 5 minutes passed, and the change was undeniable. Robert's face had lost its healthy glow and had turned a waxy, translucent gray. He stopped in the middle of a sentence about cloud security. He cleared his throat and took another sip of the juice. It was the worst thing he could have done. The audience began to murmur. They sensed a shift in energy. Sarah leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Is he okay?" She whispered. "He looks pale." I didn't answer. I was looking at the small tablet in my lap. I had a remote connection to the server room. On my screen, a progress bar was at 98%. The digital payload was almost ready to deploy. Robert tried to continue. He started a sentence about the future of the company, but his voice cracked. He looked out at the audience, his eyes wide and panicked. He was realizing that his body was no longer under his control. The internal pressure was reaching a critical mass. He tried to take a step back from the podium, but his legs seemed to buckle. He leaned heavily on the aluminum stand, his knuckles white. And then the screens changed. The Harrison IT logo didn't just disappear, shattered. In its place, a series of windows opened up. The first was a PDF of a bank transfer to an offshore account in the Grand Caymans. The amount was 7 figures. The signature at the bottom was a digital forgery of my own name, but next to it in the metadata was the IP address of Robert's private residence. The audience went silent. A few people gasped. Robert turned around, his face contorted in a mask of horror. He saw the evidence of his fraud displayed for 3,000 people in a global live stream. "What is this?" He shouted, his voice amplified by the microphone. "Technical crew, shut it down." But the technical crew couldn't shut it down. I had locked the system from the inside. The next window opened. It was a voice recording. The audio was crisp and clear, filling the ballroom with Robert's voice. "We'll use the conference as the distraction," he said. "Once the keynote is over, the funds will be moved, and David will be the one holding the bag. By the time the auditors find the discrepancy, we'll be gone." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a reputation dying in real time. Robert turned back to the audience, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked at Sarah. He looked at me. He saw the coldness in my eyes, and for a second, I think he understood. But he didn't have time to process it. The physical toll of the catalyst finally broke his final defenses. He didn't just lose his career, he lost his basic human dignity. He clutched his stomach, a look of pure agony on his face, and he fled. He didn't walk, he ran for the side of the stage, his posture stooped, his movements frantic. The cameras followed him until he disappeared behind the curtain, but the damage was done. The sound of his hasty exit was captured by the microphone and broadcast to the world. The ballroom erupted. People stood up shouting. The press scrambled toward the stage, cameras flashing like a summer storm. Sarah was frozen in her seat. Her face was as white as a sheet of paper. She looked at the screen where an email chain between her and Robert was now scrolling. It discussed the villa. They were looking at the life they were going to lead on the money they had stolen from the firm and from me. "David," she gasped. Her voice was barely a whisper. "David, you have to stop this." I stood up. I straightened my tie and looked down at her. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie. "No, Sarah," I said. "I think I've done enough." I turned and walked toward the aisle. The crowd was a sea of chaos, but I moved through it like a ghost. I saw the security guards rushing toward the server room. I saw the board members huddling in a panicked circle. I saw the investors on their phones, likely calling their brokers to dump their stock before the market even opened. The empire of Robert Harrison was crumbling into dust, and I was the only one in the room who wasn't surprised. I walked out of the ballroom and into the foyer. The air was cooler here, away from the heat of the bodies and the lights. I made my way toward the elevators. As I waited for the doors to open, I looked at the digital display in the lobby. It was still showing a welcome message for the summit. "Welcome to the future of integrity." I got into the elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors slid shut, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The weight of the lie was gone. I had spent so long looking at the patterns of their betrayal that I had almost forgotten how it felt to just exist without a secondary objective. When the elevator reached the lobby, I walked out into the street. The Chicago wind was biting and the sky was a hard, cold blue. I walked toward the lake. I could hear the sirens in the distance, the sound of the world reacting to the disaster I had created. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't feel like a villain. I just felt like an analyst who had finished a very difficult project. I reached the pier and sat on a bench looking out at the water. The waves were choppy capped with white foam. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was blowing up with messages and alerts. My name was being mentioned in every news cycle. I was the whistleblower, the man who had exposed the corruption at the heart of Harrison IT. I turned the phone off and put it back in my pocket. I didn't want to talk to the press. I didn't want to talk to the police. Not yet. I just wanted to watch the water. I thought about Robert. I wonder where he was. Probably in a bathroom somewhere in the hotel, ruined and broken. I thought about Sarah. She would be trying to find a way to spin this. She would be looking for a lawyer, trying to claim she was a victim too. But the evidence was too clear. I made sure of that. Every email, every recording, every bank transfer was linked to her as much as it was to him. She had wanted a new life, and now she had one. It just wasn't the one she had imagined. I sat there for an hour watching the city wake up around me. I felt a strange sense of gratitude for the numbers. They had never lied to me. They had shown me the truth when I was too blinded by emotion to see it. They had given me the tools to protect myself and to seek a correction. I stood up and started walking again. I had a lot of work to do. There would be lawyers and depositions and a long road to recovering my own reputation. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I knew how to navigate the system. I knew how to find the anomalies. And I knew that as long as I stayed true to the data, I would be fine. The sun was higher now, reflecting off the glass of the skyscrapers. Chicago looked like a city of gold and light. I walked toward a small coffee shop I used to visit when I was still just a junior analyst. I went inside and ordered a simple black coffee. The barista didn't recognize me. To her, I was just another man in a suit looking for a morning jolt. I sat at a small table by the window and watched the people go by. I felt a sense of freedom that was almost overwhelming. I had no boss. I had no wife. I had no home to go back to that wasn't filled with lies. I was starting over. I pulled a notebook from my bag and opened it to a blank page. I picked up a pen and wrote down a single word: integrity. Then I began to plan my next move. Not a move of revenge or a move of anger. Just a move toward a life that was honest. A life where the patterns made sense. A life where I didn't have to look for the betrayal in the silence. The summit was over. The crash had happened. And as I sat in that quiet coffee shop, I realized that the future wasn't something to be feared. It was just another data set waiting to be analyzed. And I was the best man for the job. I thought back to the moment Robert fled the stage. It was the most visceral thing I had ever seen. All the power, all the money, all the influence in the world couldn't save him from the basic reality of his own body. It was a reminder that no matter how high we build our empires, we are still just biological systems prone to failure. We are all vulnerable, and the only thing that keeps us upright is the truth. I finished my coffee and stood up. I had a phone call to make. Not to Sarah or to Robert, but to a contact I had at the district attorney's office. I had a digital file I needed to hand over. A file that would ensure that the collapse of Harrison IT was permanent. I walked out of the shop and into the bright Chicago morning. I felt light. I felt clear. I felt like myself. The walk to the DA's office took 20 minutes. I walked past the Harrison Tower and saw the crowds gathered outside. News vans were parked on the sidewalk, and people were staring up at the windows as if they expected the building to fall. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept moving. When I arrived at the office, I was greeted by a young woman at the front desk. "Can I help you?" she asked. "My name is David Miller," I said. "I have some information regarding the Harrison IT situation." Her eyes went wide. She immediately picked up the phone. A few minutes later, a man in a dark suit came out and led me into a private room. He looked tired and overwhelmed. "Mr. Miller," he said, "we've been trying to reach you. The news coming out of the summit is unprecedented." "I know," I said. "I have everything you need." I pulled a small encrypted drive from my pocket and set on the table between us. This contains the original server logs, the unedited recordings, and the complete history of the offshore transfers. It proves that I was being framed, and it shows exactly how the fraud was committed. The man looked at the drive as if it were a holy relic. This is going to change everything, he said. I know, I said. We spent the next 4 hours going through the evidence. I explained the technical details, the way the signatures had been forged, the way the internal network had been manipulated. The man took notes, his expression shifting from professional skepticism to total belief. By the time we were done, he looked at me with a new sense of respect. You really thought of everything, didn't you? He asked. I'm an analyst, I said. It's what I do. I left the office as the sun was starting to set. I felt a sense of completion. The data had been delivered. The system was now in the hands of those who would see it through to its logical conclusion. I walked back to my hotel room at the Grand Regency. The building was still buzzing with activity, but the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer a place of celebration. It was a place of mourning. The party was over. I went up to my room and found my bags packed and waiting by the door. I didn't want to spend another night in this place. I called for a car and made my way down to the lobby. As I was checking out, I saw Sarah. She was standing by the elevators, surrounded by a group of lawyers. She looked old. The sharp confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow desperation. She saw me, and for a second our eyes met. I didn't feel anything. No anger, no pichi, no regret. She was just another data point that had been removed from the set. I looked away and walked out the door. The car was waiting for me. I got in and told the driver to take me to a small hotel on the north side, a place where nobody knew my name. As we drove through the city, I watched the lights of Chicago flicker past. It was a beautiful city despite its flaws. It was a city of patterns and rhythms of growth and decay, and I was still a part of it. I arrived at the hotel and checked in under a different name. The room was small and simple, but it was clean. I sat on the bed and looked at my hands. They were steady. I had lost my job. I had lost my marriage. I had lost my home, but I had found my integrity. And as I lay down to sleep, I knew that it was the best trade I had ever made. The next morning, I woke up early. I went for a run along the lake. The air was cold and fresh, and the sound of my feet on the pavement was a steady, reassuring beat. I felt strong. I felt capable. When I got back to the hotel, I turned on news. The Harrison IT scandal was the lead story. Robert Harrison had been officially removed as CEO and was facing a litany of charges. Sarah was being named as a person of interest. The company's stock had plummeted to near zero. I turned off the TV. I didn't need to hear anymore. I knew the ending of the story because I had written it. I spent the rest of the day looking for a new place to live. I wanted something quiet, somewhere I could work on my own terms. I found a small house in a neighborhood with old trees and wide sidewalks. It had a room I could use as an office and a backyard where I could plant a garden. I signed the lease that afternoon. As I walked through the empty rooms, I felt a sense of excitement. This was my new life, a life built on a foundation of truth. I thought about the future. I knew there would be challenges. I knew the road wouldn't be easy. No я был готов. Я был Давидом Миллером и я был свободен. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal meetings and administrative tasks. I worked closely with the DA's office, providing them with whatever they needed. I watched as the case against Robert and Sarah grew stronger every day. I also started to receive offers from other firms. They had seen what I had done at the summit, and they wanted that level of analytical precision on their side. I turned them all down. I wasn't ready to go back to that world. Not yet. I wanted to focus on my own projects. I started to develop a new type of security software, one that was designed to detect internal fraud before it could take root. It was a way of using my skills for something positive, a way of preventing others from going through what I had endured. I spent my evenings in my new garden. I found a peace in the physical labor, in the simple act of planting something and watching it grow. It was a different kind of pattern, a natural one. It didn't require scripts or algorithms. It just required patience and care. One evening, as I was sitting on my porch, I saw a car pull up to the curb. A woman got out and walked toward the house. It was Sarah. She looked different. Her hair was messy and her clothes were wrinkled. The designer suit was gone, replaced by a simple pair of jeans and a sweater. She looked like a normal person, and for a second, I felt a pang of something that might have been sadness. David, she said, as she reached the steps. What are you doing here, Sarah? I asked. I just want to talk, she said. I wanted to explain. There's nothing to explain, I said. I saw the emails, Sarah. I heard the recordings. I know exactly what you were doing. She looked down at her feet. I know, and I'm sorry. I really am. I got caught up in it. Robert, he made it seem so easy. He made me feel like we could have everything. I stood up. We already had everything, Sarah. We had a life. We had a home. We had each other. But it wasn't enough for you. You wanted the world, and you were willing to destroy me to get it. She started to cry. I know, and I've lost it all. They're taking the apartment. My accounts are frozen. The firm has sued me for everything I have. I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of pity. But it was overshadowed by the memory of the tablet, glowing in the dark, the memory of the message from R.H. I can't help you, Sarah, I said. You made your choice, and now you have to live with the consequences. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. I know. I just wanted you to know that I did love you. At least at the beginning. I nodded. I believe you. But that doesn't change what happened. I walked back into the house and closed the door. I didn't look through the window to see if she was still there. I just went into my office and sat down at my desk. I had a new project to finish, a new pattern to build, and I didn't have time for the past. The trial of Robert Harrison began a few months later. It was a media circus, but I stayed away. I provided my testimony through a written deposition, preferring to keep my distance from the drama. In the end, Robert was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to a significant term in federal prison. Sarah was also convicted, but because of her cooperation with the authorities, her sentence was lighter. She was given 5 years of probation and ordered to pay a massive fine. The company Harrison IT was liquidated. The assets were sold off to pay the creditors, and the employees were let go. It was the end of an era. As for me, I became a sought-after consultant in the field of corporate security. I worked from my home office, choosing my clients carefully. I made enough money to live comfortably, but I didn't care about the wealth. I cared about the work. I spent my free time in the garden. The flowers I had planted were blooming now, a vibrant array of colors that filled the yard with scent. I watched the birds and the butterflies, and I felt a sense of connection to the world that I had never known before. I was David Miller. I was an analyst. I was a gardener. And I was a man who had found the truth. One day, as I was walking through the park, I saw a man sitting on a bench. He looked familiar. As I got closer, I realized it was one of the technicians from the Grand Regency. Hey, Mr. Miller, he said as I passed. I stopped. Hello, I said. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. It's Mark, he said. I was the one on the console the day of the summit. I nodded. I remember. You did a good job that day, Mark. He laughed. I didn't do anything. The system just went crazy. But I'll tell you something, Mr. Miller. That was the best show I've ever seen. I smiled. It was a show, wasn't it? He nodded. People still talk about it. It's like a legend in the industry. The day the machine told the truth. I like that. The day the machine told the truth. I said goodbye to Mark and continued my walk. The city of Chicago was still there, humming with its own complicated patterns. But I was no longer afraid of them. I knew how to read them. I knew how to find the beauty in the data and the integrity in the code. I reached the lake and stood at the water's edge. The waves were calm today, reflecting the clear blue of the sky. I looked out at the horizon and felt a sense of peace. The pattern was complete. The system was in balance. And I was finally truly free. As the months turned into years, the memory of the summit began to fade. I became just another face in the neighborhood, the man who grew the best tomatoes on the block. I was happy with that. I didn't need the spotlight. I had seen what it did to people. I continued to work on my software, refining it and making it more powerful. I gave it away for free to nonprofits and small businesses. It was my way of giving back, my way of making the world a little bit more transparent. I never heard from Sarah again. I heard she moved to another state, started a new life under a different name. I hoped she found whatever she was looking for. I hoped she found a way to be honest with herself. As for Robert, the first heard, he was a model prisoner. He spent his time in the library teaching other inmates how to code. It was a strange kind of justice. He was finally using his skills for something other than himself. I stayed in my small house with the big trees. I grew my garden, and I wrote my code, and I lived my life. It was a quiet life, but it was a meaningful one. I was no longer the man who lived by the numbers. I was the man who lived by the truth. And in the end, that was the only pattern that mattered. I sat on my porch as the sun began to set. The sky was a beautiful shade of pink and gold. I breathed in the cool evening air and felt a sense of profound gratitude. I was David Miller, and I was home. Looking back on it all, I realized that the betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to me. It broke me, but it also forced me to rebuild myself. It stripped away the lies and the illusions and left me with something real. It taught me that we are more than the roles we play. We are more than our jobs, our marriages, our titles. We are the sum of our choices. And the most important choice we can make is to be true to ourselves. I picked up my notebook and opened it to the first page. Integrity. I turned the page and began to write a new word. Hope. Because the future wasn't just a data set. It was a promise. A promise that no matter how dark the night, the dawn would always come. And as long as we were willing to see the truth, we would always find our way. The shadows grew longer as the sun disappeared behind the trees. I stood up and went inside, closing the door behind me. The house was warm and quiet. I lit a candle and sat down at my desk. I was ready for whatever came next. Not as an analyst, but as a man who was finally free. And as the ink flowed onto the page, I knew that this was the start of something beautiful. A new story, a new life. And it was all mine. The end of the chapter was just the beginning of the book. And I couldn't wait to see what happened on the next page. The silence of the house was a comfort, a sanctuary. I thought about the millions of people in the city, each with their own patterns and their own secrets. I wondered how many of them were living a lie. I wondered how many of them were waiting for someone to notice. I hoped that one day they would find the courage to speak their truth. I hoped that they would find their own path to freedom. But for now, I was just happy to have found mine. I finished writing and looked at the page. It wasn't a report or a spreadsheet. It was a poem, a simple expression of how I felt in that moment. It was raw and honest and real. And it was the most important thing I had ever written. I smiled and put the pen down. I was ready for bed. I blew out the candle and walked to the window. The moon was high in the sky, casting a silver light over the world. It was a beautiful night, and as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that everything was going to be okay. The pattern was complete, and I was free. The silence of my temporary suite on the north side of the city was a stark contrast to the deafening roar of the media cycle outside. I sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the gray waves of Lake Michigan churn under a leaden sky. On the glass coffee table, my phone remained dark. I had filtered all calls through a secondary server, leaving only a dedicated line for my legal team. The transition from a quiet analyst to the man who had dismantled a tech empire in 45 minutes was a shift in reality that most would find jarring, but to me it felt like the logical conclusion of a very long and complex equation. I spent the first few hours of the morning reviewing the financial fallout. Harrison IT stock had not just dipped, it had entered a terminal velocity that triggered a series of automatic halts on the exchange. The board of directors had held an emergency meeting at 3 in the morning, and by 4 they had officially stripped Robert of his title and his access to any corporate assets. He was now a liability, a ghost in the very machine he had spent 20 years building. I heard the soft chime of the door. I didn't need to check the security feed to know who it was. Sarah had always been a creature of habit, and her desperation had a specific cadence. I walked to the door and opened it. She stood there looking like a shadow of the woman who had sat beside me at the conference. Her expensive charcoal suit was wrinkled, and her eyes were framed by the dark circles of a sleepless night. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past me into the room, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood floor. "David, we have to talk," she said, her voice pitched on the edge of a scream. "This has gone too far. You have to tell them it was a mistake. You have to tell the press that the server was compromised by an outside party." I closed the door slowly and leaned against it, crossing my arms. I watched her as she paced the length of the living area, her hands trembling as she clutched her designer handbag. I didn't say anything. I simply watched the data point that was my wife finally realize the magnitude of the correction I had implemented. The lawyers are everywhere, David, she continued, turning to face me. They've frozen the joint accounts. They're talking about civil litigation for the loss of shareholder value. Robert isn't a private medical facility, but the board has already replaced him. They're going after everything. Our house, the studio, the investments. You're destroying us. I walked toward the kitchen island and poured a glass of water. I took a slow sip before speaking. I'm not destroying anything, Sarah. I'm merely allowing the consequences of your actions to reach their natural destination. You and Robert decided to use my name to cover a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. You decided to treat our marriage as a convenient camouflage for a professional betrayal. I am simply the auditor who found the discrepancy. She walked toward me, her face contorted in a mix of rage and pleading. I did it for us, David. Robert promised me that once we had the capital, we could move away. We could start our own firm. I was tired of being the wife of a quiet analyst who never wanted more than a comfortable life. I wanted influence. I wanted to be at the top. And you were willing to sacrifice my freedom to get it. I said, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. You were willing to let me sit in a courtroom and take the blame for a crime I didn't commit, so you could live in a villa on the Mediterranean with a man who views people as disposable tools. That wasn't for us, Sarah. That was for you. She reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back. The rejection was physical, and she flinched as if I had struck her. David, please. I know you're hurt. I know I made a mistake. No my możemy to isprawić. We can hire the best crisis management team. We can say the recordings were fabricated by a competitor. If we stand together, they won't be able to prove anything. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small leather folder. I set on the counter between us. I think you should read this before you continue your performance, Sarah. She frowned and opened the folder. As her eyes scanned the documents, her face drained of what little color was left. These are the trust agreements, I said. 2 years ago, when we did the estate planning, you signed a series of amendments. You were so busy with your studio and your meetings with Robert that you didn't bother to read the fine print. I had the assets moved into a protected trust for my mother's long-term care and for a charitable foundation focused on digital ethics. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock. You moved the house. You moved the investments? I moved everything that was legally mine to move, I replied. And there is a specific clause in our prenuptial agreement, Sarah. Clause 14, Section B. It's a moral turpitude clause. It states that in the event of documented professional fraud or proven infidelity that leads to the legal or financial endangerment of the other spouse, the offending party forfeits all claims to shared marital assets. You planned this, she whispered. You've been planning this for years. No, Sarah, I said. I prepared for it. There's a difference. I hoped I would never have to execute those documents. I hoped that my analysis of the patterns in our marriage was wrong. I hoped that the late nights and the secret calls were just the stresses of your career. But a good analyst always accounts for the worst-case scenario. When I found a message on your tablet, it wasn't a surprise. It was just the final confirmation of a trend I had been tracking for months. She dropped the folder on the counter, the papers scattering like dead leaves. You're a monster, she said, her voice breaking. You've left me with nothing. I gave you exactly what you asked for, Sarah. You wanted to be free. You wanted to be away from the quiet life we had. Now you are. You have no husband, no home, and no connection to the firm. You have your talent, and you have your ambition. Let's see how far they take you without my support and Robert's stolen capital. She looked around the room as if searching for an escape, but the reality of her situation was a cage with no doors. She realized that I wasn't the man she thought I was. I wasn't the passive observer who stayed in the background. I was the one who had written the code for her downfall. She didn't say another word. She grabbed her bag and walked out the door, her shoulders slumped, her head bowed. I watched her go through the security feed, and I felt a strange sense of emptiness. It wasn't grief. It was the feeling of a completed task. An hour later, my lawyer Marcus called. He was one of the top litigators in the city, a man who specialized in the kind of high-stakes corporate warfare that was now unfolding. David, we've received a communication from the board's legal counsel, he said. They've reviewed the data you provided. They are offering you a full indemnity and a severance package that exceeds your wildest expectations if you agree to testify as a lead witness in the civil and criminal proceedings against Robert Harrison. I sat back in my chair looking at the gray lake. And what about the accounts Robert tried to link to me? They've been cleared, Marcus replied. The board's forensic team found the scripts Robert used to forge your signature. They've documented the IP addresses and the timestamps. You're completely exonerated. In fact, they're terrified you might sue them for negligence. They want this handled quietly and quickly. Tell them I accept the indemnity, I said. But I don't want the severance package. I want the rights to the security protocols I developed. I want the intellectual property back. Marcus laughed. They'll give you the moon if it means you'll stop talking, David. I'll draft the agreement. I hung up the phone and felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. I had my reputation, I had my freedom, and I had the tools to build something new. The destruction of Robert Harrison was not just a personal victory, it was a systemic cleansing. I looked at the news feed on my computer. Robert had been officially served with a series of lawsuits. His personal accounts were frozen, and the luxury penthouse he owned in the Gold Coast was being seized as part of the corporate recovery process. He went from being a billionaire to a man who couldn't pay his own legal fees in less than 24 hours. I thought about the night before the conference. I thought about the way he had smiled at me and told me I was his secret weapon. He was right in a way. I was the weapon that he had sharpened and aimed at himself. He had underestimated the man who looked at the numbers. He had forgotten that the quietest people are often the ones who hear the most. As the afternoon turned into evening, the fog began to lift from the city. The lights of the skyscrapers began to twinkle like a grid of data points. I felt a sense of clarity that I hadn't known in years. I was no longer defined by my job or my marriage. I was a man who had faced the abyss of betrayal and had built a bridge across it. I walked to the kitchen and made a simple meal. I didn't need the luxury of the life I had left behind. I realized that the things I had valued, the status, the comfort, the predictability, were all illusions. The only thing that mattered was the integrity of the data. The truth was the only thing that remained when everything else was stripped away. I spent the evening reviewing the protocols I had reclaimed. They were more than just code. They were a shield against the kind of deception that had nearly ruined me. I began to envision a new firm, a firm built on the principle of radical transparency. A firm where the analysts were the ones in charge. I thought about the long road ahead. There would be months of legal battles, months of depositions and testimony. I would have to face Robert and Sarah across a courtroom table. I would have to recount the details of their betrayal over and over again. But I wasn't afraid. I was prepared. I had the evidence, and I had the truth. I stood on the balcony and felt the cold Chicago air on my face. The city was a vast and complex system, always moving, always changing. And I was finally a part on my own terms. I wasn't a cog in someone else's machine anymore. I was the architect of my own life. I looked out at the horizon where the dark water of the lake met the dark sky. There was a faint line of light beginning to appear, a sign of the moon rising behind clouds. It was a beautiful sight. I took a deep breath and felt a sense of peace. The correction was complete. The system was in balance. And for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to the next day. I went back inside and closed the door. The suite was quiet and warm. I sat at my desk and opened a new file. I didn't start with numbers or charts. I started with a single sentence. This is the beginning of the end of the old world. I worked for hours, the keys on my laptop clicking in the silence. I was no longer analyzing the past. I was building the future. And this time I would make sure that the patterns were strong enough to hold. I wouldn't be blinded by trust or affection. I would look at the data and I would follow it wherever it led. As the clock struck midnight, I felt a sense of profound satisfaction. I had survived the crash. I had weathered the storm, and I had come out on the other side stronger and wiser. I was David Miller, and I was finally in control. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. I went for a run along the lakefront, the cold air stinging my lungs. I felt alive. I felt powerful. I watched the sun rise over the water, casting a golden light over the city. It was a new day and a new beginning. I went back to the suite and checked the news. Robert Harrison's name was still at the top of the headlines, but the story was changing. It was no longer a story about a brilliant CEO. It was a story about a cautionary tale. A story about the price of greed and the power of the truth. I saw a photo of Sarah leaving her lawyer's office. She looked small and defeated. I didn't feel any joy in her suffering, but I didn't feel any regret either. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. We were both living with the consequences. I spent the rest of the day in meetings with my legal team. We went over the strategy for the upcoming proceedings. We reviewed the evidence and the witness list. Everything was in order. We were ready. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, I saw a group of reporters gathered on the sidewalk. They saw me and rushed forward, their microphones extended, their cameras flashing. Mr. Miller, Mr. Miller, what do you have to say about the allegations against Robert Harrison? I stopped and looked at them. I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't expected. I realized that I didn't have to hide anymore. I didn't have to be the quiet analyst in the background. The data speaks for itself, I said. I have provided the evidence to the proper authorities, and I have full confidence in the legal process. The truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deep you try to bury it. I walked away, leaving them to scramble for their next headline. I felt a sense of freedom that was almost overwhelming. I was no longer a victim of a conspiracy. I was the one who had exposed it. I spent the evening at a small park near my new apartment. I sat on a bench and watched the children playing. I felt a sense of connection to the world that I hadn't felt in a long time. I realized that the most important things in life weren't the things that could be quantified. They were the things that couldn't be bought or sold. They were the things that were built on a foundation of honesty and respect. I looked at the trees, their leaves turning gold and red in the autumn air. It was a reminder that everything has its season. A season for growth, a season for decay, and a season for rebirth. I was in the season of my rebirth, and I was going to make the most of it. I went back home and sat in the quiet of my living room. I didn't turn on the TV or the computer. I just sat and thought about the journey I had been on. I thought about the man I used to be and the man I had become. I realized that the betrayal had been a catalyst for my own evolution. It had forced me to see the world as it really was, and it had given me the strength to change it. I was ready for the final chapter. I was ready for the peace that I knew was coming. I was ready to live my life on my own terms. As I closed my eyes, I felt a sense of profound gratitude. I had survived. I had won, and I was finally free. The chapter was closing, and the story was moving toward its conclusion. But I knew that the ending would be a happy one. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was true. And in the end, that was all that mattered. I thought about the word justice. It wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about restoration. It was about making things right. And as I sat in the silence of my new home, I knew that I had achieved justice. I had restored the balance, and I had reclaimed my life. The sun set over the city, leaving a trail of orange and pink in the sky. I watched the colors fade into the gray of twilight. It was a beautiful ending to a long day. And as the stars began to appear, I knew that the morning would bring a new light. A light that would shine on a world that was a little bit more honest and a little bit more just because of what I had done. I was David Miller, and I was at peace. Would you like me to continue with the final chapter where David finds his ultimate closure and starts his new life on the ruin of those who try to destroy him? The fluorescent lights of the federal courthouse had a way of stripping the glamour from even the most powerful men, and as I sat in the witness gallery for the last time, I felt the weight of the last few months finally beginning to lift. Robert Harrison sat at the defense table, but he was no longer the Titan I had known. The sharp custom suits were gone, replaced by a standard dark blazer that seemed too large for his shrunken frame. His hair had thinned, and the arrogance that once defined his every movement had been replaced by a vacant stare directed at the mahogany table. Next to him, Sarah sat with her legal team, her face a mask of pale exhaustion. She did not look at me. She spent the entire session staring at a small crack in the floorboards as if she could disappear into it. When the judge finally spoke, the words were a series of technical financial terms and legal citations, but the message was clear. Robert was being stripped of his assets, his titles, and his future in the corporate world. The evidence I had provided, the logs, the recordings, the hidden offshore trails, was undeniable. It was a total professional erasure. He was ordered to pay restitution that would leave him in a state of permanent financial insolvency, and the court imposed a lifetime ban on him holding any position of trust or leadership in a public company. As for Sarah, the court was less severe, but the social and financial consequences were just as final. She was a co-conspirator in a high-profile fraud and in the world of high-end design, where reputation is the only currency. She was now bankrupt. I watched them as they were led out of the courtroom. There were no dramatic shouts, no tears of regret. There was only the cold mechanical sound of the process moving on to the next case. I walked out of the building and into the crisp afternoon air. The Chicago wind felt different today. It did not feel like a challenge, it felt like a clean slate. I drove back to my new office on the outskirts of the city. It was not a glass tower with a view of the lake. It was a modest brick building with large windows that let in the natural light and a small team of 3 analysts who shared my belief in the integrity of the data. We were not building an empire, we were building a sanctuary for the truth. I sat at my desk and opened a file that did not contain spreadsheets or code. It was a collection of photos of the new house, the garden, and the quiet life I had begun to cultivate. I realized then that the most effective form of justice was not the punishment of the guilty, but the flourishing of the innocent. Robert and Sarah had tried to use me as a foundation for their lies, and in doing so they had only succeeded in highlighting the strength of my own character. I had taken their betrayal and used it as a catalyst for my own evolution. I spent the afternoon working on a new protocol for detecting internal anomalies in nonprofit organizations. I wanted to give back to the world that had nearly taken everything from me. As the sun began to set, I looked out at the street where the neighbors were coming home from work and children were riding their bikes. This was the ordinary life that Sarah had looked down upon and that Robert had viewed as a sign of weakness. To me, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was real, it was honest, and it was mine. I thought about the night I found the notification on her tablet and the long, cold journey that followed. I did not feel the sting of the betrayal anymore. I felt only a sense of profound gratitude for the clarity it had provided. It had shown me who I was and what I was capable of. It had forced me to stand up and claim my own reality. I picked up my phone and saw a message from my lawyer. The final papers for the divorce and the asset protection trust had been signed. I was officially untethered from the past. I felt a surge of lightness, a sense of freedom that I had not felt since I was a child. I was David Miller, and I was starting over with a heart that was no longer guarded by suspicion, but by wisdom. I walked to the door of my office and turned off the lights. The city hummed in the distance, its patterns continuing as they always had, but I was no longer trying to control them. I was simply living within them. I walked to my car and drove home to the quiet house with the big trees and the garden that was waiting for the spring. The pattern was complete. The system was balanced, and the story was finally and truly finished. I was home, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I belonged. The world was vast and full of data, but the most important truth I had found was the one within myself. I watched the way Robert's hands shook as he tried to pick up a pen. This was the man who once moved millions with a single keystroke, and now he could not even manage a steady grip. It was a profound reminder of how fragile the structures of power really are when they're built on a foundation of deceit. The public disgrace of the conference had been the visible crack in the dam, but the legal proceedings had been the final collapse. He had lost the respect of his peers, the loyalty of his board, and the admiration of the public. He was now a cautionary tale mentioned in hushed tones during business school lectures as an example of what happens when the ego outpaces the ethics. Sarah had moved into a small apartment in a part of the city she used to mock. She had tried to reach out to her old friends, but the calls went unreturned. She had discovered that her value in that world was entirely tied to the status she had shared with Robert. Without the penthouse, the gala invitations, and the professional backing of a CEO, she was invisible. I did not feel a sense of triumph as I observed their struggle. It was more like watching a natural disaster from a safe distance. You acknowledge the tragedy, but you also understand the inevitability of the forces at work. They had sowed the seeds of their own ruin, and I had simply been the one to document the harvest. In my new office, the atmosphere was different. There were no hidden agendas, no secret meetings behind closed doors. We worked in the light. My new team consisted of people who had been overlooked by firms like Harrison IT, because they were not aggressive or flashy. They were quiet, diligent, and brilliant. We spent our days helping small businesses protect themselves and ensuring that the data they relied on was accurate and secure. It was fulfilling work that did not require me to sacrifice my peace of mind. I had discovered that the most powerful thing a person can possess is their own name, and I had worked hard to ensure that the name David Miller was synonymous with integrity. As the evening progressed, I sat on my porch and watched the fireflies begin to flicker in the tall grass. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the coming winter. I thought about the concept of a closed loop. In analytics, a closed loop is a system where the output is used as an input to keep the process stable. My life had become a closed loop of honesty. Every action I took was grounded in the truth, and every result I achieved was a reflection of that commitment. I was no longer looking for the next betrayal or waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was simply present. The finality of it all hit me as I looked at the dark silhouette of the Chicago skyline on the horizon. I was a part of that city, but I was no longer a slave to its pace. I had found my own rhythm. I had found a way to be a successful man without being a compromised man. I thought about the dose of reality I had delivered and realized it was the kindest thing I could have done for everyone involved. It forced us all to face the truth. It forced us all to stop pretending. And while the truth had destroyed the lives Robert and Sarah had built, it had allowed me to build a life that was worth living. I went inside and closed the door against the evening chill. The house was quiet, but it did not feel lonely. It felt full of possibility. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had once sat in a state of shock and despair. Now I sat there in a state of calm. I had reclaimed my space and my time. I had reclaimed my life. I picked up a book and began to read, not for information, but for pleasure. The patterns of the words on the page were a comfort. I was David Miller, and my story was no longer being written by others. I was the author now, and the ending was exactly what I had wanted it to be. I was at peace. I was home, and I was finally free.